Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The roast chicken was dry. That's the first thing I remember. My mother always overcooked it, convinced a little pink meant certain death. Sat there in the middle of the table like a prize turkey in a war zone, slightly burnt, surrounded by steamed vegetables that had long since given up any resistance. The dining room was dim, filled with that yellowish ceiling light that made everyone look 10 years older and one drink deeper. My father sat at the head of the table, quiet as always, occasionally nodding at whatever was being said. He didn't speak unless necessary, and tonight he clearly didn't see the point. Across from me sat Greg, my older brother, the golden boy, the poster child for how to do life right. He was wearing that smug tailored shirt with the sleeves rolled up just enough to show the Rolex, his fork tapping the edge of the plate like he was orchestrating his own applause. His hair was too perfect. His wife wasn't there, thank God, but that didn't stop him from talking about her Pilates studio and the new BMW she got, just because she was having a rough month. He said that with a chuckle, then downed half his wine like the words tasted sour coming out. Mom sat between us, beaming. She always lit up when Greg talked, like his voice ran on batteries and she needed to charge. She threw in the occasional, "Oh, that's wonderful, honey," or "Did you hear that, Eliza?" as if I needed her to interpret every success story for me like a slow child. I nodded when I had to. I smiled when I remembered. But mostly, I just kept chewing, slowly, silently. Greg had just come back from Denver, or was it Dallas? Doesn't matter, some city with corporate towers and steakhouse meetings. He'd landed a deal that brought his firm, and himself, an ungodly bonus. He used words like leverage and scaling solutions, and Mom acted like he was curing cancer. And then there was me, at the end of the table, wearing a black cardigan that had tiny paint smudges on the sleeve. No one but me probably noticed. I hadn't sold a painting in 3 weeks. I'd picked up a barista shift at a bookstore cafe to cover rent. I still painted at night, always at night, when the world shut up and the noise went quiet, and I could breathe again. But nobody at that table wanted to hear about that. Not really. "Still doing your little painting thing?" my mom had asked earlier, stirring the gravy with a metal ladle like it owed her money. Greg waited until dessert. It was almost ritual. He didn't strike too early. He wasn't stupid. He let the wine settle, let the buzz warm everyone's cheeks. Then he leaned back, knife resting on his finished plate, and turned his eyes toward me. "You know, I was thinking," he said, pausing just long enough to draw attention. "Maybe it's time you, I don't know, considered something a little more practical." It wasn't a question. It was a performance, a setup, a layup to the punchline he'd already rehearsed. "Like what?" I asked without looking up. "I don't know, something with a paycheck," he grinned. "You've got, what, 2 degrees in interpretive brushstrokes and existential giraffes?" The table laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, but it was enough. That low, half-embarrassed kind of laughter that said, "We all agree, but we're too polite to say it." Mom shook her head with a smile, like he was just being cheeky. Dad didn't say a word. Aunt Rochelle raised an eyebrow but said nothing. And me, I kept eating. I didn't look at Greg. I didn't argue. What was there to argue? That I was passionate? That art mattered? That I had something worth saying even if the world wasn't ready to hear it yet? I'd done that speech before, at this very table, and all it ever got me was a lecture about 401ks and the virtue of reliable paychecks. Greg wasn't done. "You know what I think the problem is," he said, pushing his chair back slightly, the old wood creaking like it wanted to protest, but was too tired to try. "You never really wanted to grow up. You just wanted to feel like you were special. But art's not special, Liza. It's a hobby, something kids do before they get real jobs. But hey, maybe one day you'll paint something good enough to hang in a dentist's office." I heard the words, but they felt like background noise, like static on a bad radio channel. I stabbed another bite of chicken, chewed, swallowed. Just keep eating, Eliza. "You'll never make it," he added quietly. Not to the whole table, just to me. A lean in, a whisper, intimate and sharp like a needle through the ribs. And you know it. That's when Aunt Rochelle spoke for the first time in over 20 minutes. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like scissors through silk. "You ever get tired of hearing yourself talk, Greg?" His smile faltered for a second, then came back twice as big. "Come on, Auntie Ro. I'm just trying to help our dear starving artist here face the music." Rochelle murmured. Then she reached into her purse, this big leopard print thing that always looked out of place, and pulled out her phone. I assumed she was going to show pictures of her cat or grandkids or something to change the subject. But she didn't. She tapped the screen a few times, then held it up, but only to me. "That you?" she asked, quiet and calm. I leaned over and squinted. It was blurry at first. The phone was shaking a little, but then it clicked. And my fork stopped moving. It was my painting. Big, bold, oil on canvas, the one I called Solace in Ruin, hung behind a polished wooden desk, the seal of the state visible in the corner, a man in a suit giving a speech in front of it. Cameras flashing, microphones held up. And there it was, my signature in the bottom right corner, my damn painting behind the damn governor of Pennsylvania. And suddenly, the roast chicken didn't taste like cardboard anymore. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. Not to them. I just looked up, met Greg's eyes, and smiled. Not smug, not cruel, just the kind of smile that says, "You have no idea what's coming." It's funny how people always think silence means surrender, as if keeping your mouth shut makes you weak, or that not defending yourself automatically means you agree. But the truth is, sometimes silence is the only weapon you've got left when the room is already against you. And that night, while the roast chicken cooled on our plates and Greg licked his ego like it was a damn trophy, I let them think whatever they wanted. Because letting someone underestimate you is the cheapest kind of revenge there is. It costs you nothing, and you get to watch them trip over their own damn pride. When I got home that night, after the quiet car ride with Dad, who said nothing but turn the heat up just a little without asking, I dropped my bag by the door, kicked off my shoes, and sat on the floor. Not the couch, not the chair, the floor. I always liked sitting there, legs crossed, back to the bookshelf I built myself, with all the old sketchbooks lined up like silent witnesses to every disappointment and every small victory. The apartment was small. Just one bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough to open the fridge and oven at the same time, and a leak in the bathroom ceiling that showed up like clockwork every winter. But it was mine, and it was quiet, and it smelled like oil paint and coffee, and I could breathe there. I didn't open the laptop right away. Instead, I stared at the canvas leaning against the wall by the window, half finished. The background was done, deep reds and browns, streaked with black like bruises beneath the surface. I hadn't decided what was going in the foreground yet. Maybe a tree, maybe a woman turning away from a crowd, maybe just negative space. Sometimes not knowing was part of the process. You just kept showing up until something started talking to you. 3 years ago, I almost quit. It was a Tuesday in February, and I remember because the light in the studio was awful and I hadn't sold a damn thing in months. I'd applied to a local gallery 5 times. 5 polite, desperate emails with carefully chosen images and a bio that sounded professional and miserable. And every time they sent back some version of the same rejection. "We're not currently looking for new artists. Your work isn't the right fit for our space. Try us again next season." That last one felt especially cruel, as if I was a houseplant they were hoping would die on its own. I worked nights at a bookstore cafe back then, made enough to cover rent and maybe a few canvases if I skipped groceries. Mark, the guy I was dating, told me I needed to stop chasing the fantasy. He said it in the kind of voice people use when they're being gentle but also think you're an idiot. "You're talented, babe, but talent doesn't mean shit without a plan," he said, holding my wrist like I was going to bolt if he let go. "You could teach art, maybe, or do design work, something stable. You don't want to end up like 40 and still broke." The thing is, I already was broke. I didn't care about 40. I cared about the way my hands shook when I couldn't paint. I cared about the ache in my chest when I walked past blank walls and imagined what they could hold. I cared about the voice inside me that refused to shut up, even when the world told me I had nothing worth saying. So I told Mark to leave, and he did. No big speech, no door slam, just a shrug and a look that said, "Your funeral." I'd almost given up. I came home one night, dropped my bag, stared at a blank canvas for maybe an hour, then pulled out a trash bag and started throwing old paint tubes in. That was the plan. Clean it all out. Find a real job. Maybe become someone my mother could finally be proud of. But then something stupid happened. That weekend, I went to the flea market. Not to sell, just to walk. Sometimes I did that. Watched people buy junk, eat funnel cakes, argue over vinyl records. It made me feel less alone, I guess. And there, tucked between a guy selling taxidermied birds and a woman with handmade jewelry, was a booth with blank canvases and one tiny sign. "Show us what you've got. First 10 paintings get free wall space." I had one in my trunk. A piece I hadn't shown anyone. It was moody and dark, too messy for a gallery. I almost didn't bring it in, but something in me, some tiny, pissed-off voice, said, "Just try one more time, you coward." So I did. They hung it near the back. No label, no spotlight. But 3 hours later, someone bought it. Cash, no questions. Just pointed at it and said, "That one feels like how I dream." I almost cried. I didn't tell my family. Not about the flea market, not about the sale, not about the woman with the eyes like she'd seen every dark corner of the world and finally found one that looked familiar. They wouldn't have understood. They would have asked how much I got for it, or if the person who bought it was connected, or whether I had business cards. They didn't know how to talk about joy unless it came with a tax bracket. A few months later, I got an email. It looked fake at first, like spam. The subject line was just, "Your painting." No body, just an attachment, a photo of my piece. The same one from the flea market, hanging in a conference room, clean white walls, leather chairs, an American flag in the corner. A note below, "Can we talk about a larger commission?" I Googled the name in the email signature. Assistant to the governor. I didn't respond right away. I let it sit there, like something fragile, touched it a few times, walked away. Finally wrote back after 3 days, trying not to sound desperate. They said someone from the state's Cultural Arts Board had bought the piece, brought it in for a meeting, and the governor noticed it. Said it reminded him of his childhood in a coal town. Said it looked like pain done right. They wanted more. I didn't tell anyone, not even my best friend. I painted, I delivered, I got paid. Not a fortune, but enough to breathe again. And more than that, I got proof. That I wasn't crazy, that my voice meant something, and I kept it all to myself. Because what they don't know, well, sometimes that's where the real power lives. By the time dessert made its reluctant way to the table, with Mom insisting on serving everyone her famous apple crumble, which was neither famous nor particularly good, the room had settled into that cozy, bloated haze that families often mistake for peace. But underneath the surface, just below the polite laughter and clinking spoons, something electric had started to hum. It was subtle, quiet, like a slow-dripping faucet in a silent house, but it was there. Greg was still talking. Of course he was. At this point, it would have taken an actual earthquake to shut him up. And even then, he'd probably keep explaining the stock market through the tremors. He'd just finished bragging about a recent client who flew him to Chicago first class just to consult for 2 hours, and how, quote, "they handed me a check bigger than most people's annual salary." He said it with that infuriating mix of mock humility and weaponized pride that made you want to either laugh in his face or shove a fork in your own ear. Mom chuckled, shook her head like she'd raised a real character, and passed him another helping of crumble. "You're really making waves, Greg," she said, her voice that special tone she reserved for moments of pure maternal awe. "I just don't know how you do it all." Greg gave a humble shrug, though it was clear he absolutely knew how he did it all, and he was counting on the rest of us to ask him again so he could give a longer answer. I was quiet. I hadn't said more than 5 words since Aunt Rochelle showed me the photo of my painting behind the governor. The photo was still etched into my mind like a burn mark. But I hadn't said a thing, not yet, not to anyone else at the table. I didn't need to, because Rochelle wasn't done. She was sitting with that slow, deliberate calm of a woman who'd seen every lie in the room and was just deciding which one to cut open first. Her phone was back in her purse, but she hadn't looked away from me since she'd shown it. It wasn't pity in her eyes. It wasn't pride either. It was something sharper, like she knew a secret was about to spill, and she wanted to see how the spill would stain. Then she asked a question, simple, unassuming, but wrapped in something heavier. "Do you still paint those weird birds?" The room shifted, just slightly, a flick of air in a sealed jar. Mom looked up from her plate, frowning a little like the question was off topic. Greg snorted. "Oh yeah," he said, reaching for his glass. "You mean the ones with the oversized wings and creepy little heads? I remember one of those hanging in the garage years ago." I felt my jaw tighten, not from anger, not even from hurt, just from the effort of holding still. I nodded slowly. "Sometimes." Greg leaned forward, elbows on the table like he was a talk show host getting ready to mock a guest. "You ever think about illustrating children's books with them? Might be your best bet for turning that, talent into something marketable." I didn't answer. I didn't have to, because then Mom jumped in, cutting off whatever smugness Greg was about to pour onto the table like cheap wine. "Well," she said, trying to sound lighthearted but not quite managing, "she's working at a coffee shop now, right? That's at least something steady." And there it was again, that word, steady, their favorite word, the word they clung to like a life raft in a world they didn't understand. It didn't matter that the coffee shop was part-time. It didn't matter that I paid my rent last month with 1 check from the state of Pennsylvania. It didn't matter that I had a painting cataloged in a national archive now, because to them, none of it was real unless they could explain it, or frame it in a way that made sense next to Greg's resume. And then, without missing a beat, Aunt Rochelle said something that made every fork stop halfway to every mouth at the table. "Is this you hanging in the governor's office?" The room fell dead silent. Not the polite kind of quiet, where everyone's just pausing between bites or waiting for someone to speak. No, this was the kind of silence that feels physical, that presses on your chest and makes your ears ring with the sheer absence of noise. Like a vacuum just opened up in the middle of dinner and sucked all the usual nonsense right out of the room. I didn't move. Not right away. My first thought wasn't even fear. It was confusion. Not because I didn't know what she was talking about, but because I didn't know why she was choosing to say it now. I looked up. Rochelle was holding her phone again, screen tilted slightly so Greg and Mom could see. She didn't zoom in. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. The photo spoke for itself. It was the same one she showed me earlier. A press conference. The governor in a navy suit. Standing in front of my painting. Not a print. Not a replica. The real thing. And clear as day, in the bottom corner, my crooked signature. Painted in ochre, just above the frame. Greg stared at the screen, blinked. Mom leaned in. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Dad looked up from his plate for the first time in 15 minutes and just stared at me. Then Rochelle said, very calmly, "That's one of hers, right, Eliza?" I met her eyes. I saw the gleam there. Not gloating, not cruel. Just the satisfaction of watching a truth land exactly where it needed to. I nodded, just once. Greg looked like he'd swallowed a lemon whole. "Wait, hold on. How the hell? I guess someone thought those creepy birds were worth something." Rochelle cut in, still not raising her voice, but making sure every word had the weight of a brick through glass. Mom opened her mouth again. Nothing came out. Then finally, in a voice so small it barely made it across the table, she said, "But how?" I didn't answer. I wasn't going to explain. Not because I was trying to be mysterious, and not because I wanted to gloat. I just didn't owe them an explanation anymore. They never asked about the years I spent freezing in a loft with no heat, painting through tendon pain because I couldn't afford to stop. They never asked about the time I sold my phone to buy a new set of brushes. They never asked about the flea market, the commission, the gallery deal I signed last month under a name they've never even heard of. They never asked, so now they wouldn't know. And the silence around the table grew just a little heavier, because the truth was hanging there in front of them, and they had no idea what to do with it. For a moment so brief, it might have passed unnoticed in another house. The table held its breath. The kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks, glass or trust or ego. Greg's face went a shade darker, not red exactly, but that mottled flush men get when they realize the story they've been narrating in their head doesn't match what's actually happening in front of them. He opened his mouth like he was about to reclaim control, maybe twist it all into a joke, or accuse Aunt Rochelle of being mistaken, but the words caught somewhere in the back of his throat, and all that came out was a weird half-laugh that sounded like a cough. He reached for his wine glass, missed, knocked over a spoon instead. Aunt Rochelle didn't move. She sat there like a statue, eyes never leaving Greg, the phone still resting in her hand, face lit from below by the screen. She wasn't looking at the photo anymore. She didn't have to. Everyone at that table had seen it now, and no amount of denial or spin could put it back into the shadows. And in that one still frame, with the governor standing tall and proud in front of my painting, years of dismissal, of casual insults, of polite chuckles at my expense, were suddenly rendered absurd. But I didn't smile, I didn't smirk. There was no satisfaction in watching them squirm, not the kind that feeds you, not the kind that feels like victory. What I felt was something colder, something quieter, like being alone in a museum after hours, all the lights off, and realizing you don't need applause to make the art matter. Greg recovered first, of course. He always did. People like him don't stay down long, not because they're strong, but because they refuse to entertain the possibility that they ever truly lost. He leaned back in his chair, trying to recompose himself with the slow arrogance of a man, determined to write the next line of the conversation himself. "Well, I mean," he said, his voice too loud now, forced casual. "I'm not saying she's not talented or whatever. I just didn't realize she'd, gone public with her work. Gone public. Like I was some scandal he missed during market hours." Mom gave him a look, just a flicker of concern, like maybe he should ease off. But she didn't defend me either. She just folded her napkin neatly in her lap. A nervous tic she'd perfected over decades of ignoring unpleasant truths. She looked at me like she wanted a lifeline, something to cling to, something that could explain how this thing, the art she'd always treated like a phase, had somehow slipped past her, grown legs, and found its way into one of the most important offices in the state. But I gave her nothing, no story, no reassurance. She didn't deserve to hear the details. Then Dad spoke. Just 3 words, simple, barely above a whisper. "You did good." Everyone turned to look at him. I don't think I'd heard him say that to anyone in over a decade. He was a quiet man, ex-Marine, the kind of guy who believed in actions over words and respect over showmanship. He hadn't smiled once all evening, but now he looked right at me, into me, and I felt the weight of everything he wasn't saying. All the times he hadn't stepped in. All the dinners he'd sat through, silent while Greg jabbed at me, silent while Mom played favorites, silent when I left the house that last time, and didn't come back for 2 years. And now here he was, giving me more than they ever had, in 3 small words. I nodded once slowly. That was enough. Greg scoffed. "Come on, Dad, don't make it sound like she won a Pulitzer or something." That's when Rochelle, still calm, still steady, said, "You might want to check today's New York Times, too." That one landed like a hammer dropped on porcelain. Every eye swung back to her. Mom's mouth opened into a perfect O. Greg froze. Even Dad looked a little surprised, though he didn't say anything. Page 22, Rochelle added, casually sipping her coffee like she was talking about the weather. Art section, third column. Nobody moved for a second, and then Greg, too proud to ask, too rattled to stay still, pulled out his phone. He typed fast, brows furrowed, lips pressed into a line so tight it looked painful. I watched the screen reflect in his glasses, watched the confusion turn to something else. Not rage, not disbelief. It was closer to fear. He didn't say a word, but the silence that followed screamed louder than anything else could have. My name was there, printed clean and bold in a national publication next to the word Emerging Visionary. They'd called the painting haunting, claimed it held echoes of Edward Hopper and Francis Bacon, said my work wasn't just art. It was testimony, a kind of quiet rebellion rendered in oil. I hadn't seen the article yet. Rochelle had, clearly, and never mentioned it. Probably saved it for this exact moment. And sitting there, surrounded by faces that no longer knew how to look at me, I realized something I didn't expect. I wasn't angry anymore. I'd carried their voices in my head for so long, the doubts, the judgments, the jokes. But in that moment, they felt weightless. They couldn't touch me anymore. Not really. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew what it had cost me to get here. The hours spent alone, the rejection, the meals skipped to buy better brushes, the nights I cried in the studio with raw paint under my fingernails, and no clue whether anything I made would matter to anyone but me. I knew how to survive in a world that didn't want me to succeed. And now that I was here, really here, they didn't know how to survive in mine. Greg finally spoke, but his voice was different now, smaller, like he wasn't sure where the floor had gone beneath his feet. You should have told us. I tilted my head slightly, pretending to think about it, then said, Why? No one answered. Rochelle smiled. Then I stood up slowly, pushed my chair in with deliberate care, and picked up my plate. I'll do the dishes. No one stopped me. No one offered to help. And as I walked into the kitchen, I felt it behind me, that shift in gravity, that moment when the axis tilts and the world doesn't quite know how to right itself again. They'd spent so long talking about me like I was a ghost in the room, a shadow hanging on the edge of failure, and now they didn't even know what shape I was anymore. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to fight. I'd already won. The water ran hot, hotter than it needed to be, curling steam around my arms as I scrubbed a plate that was already clean. I could hear them behind me, shifting chairs, hushed movements, awkward throat clears, but no one came in. No one offered to dry or asked where the dish towels were kept. No one made another joke. The quiet in the dining room wasn't comfortable anymore. It wasn't the lazy, satisfied kind of silence that fills a house after a big meal. It was tight, drawn out, and brittle, like someone had just confessed something unforgivable, and everyone was waiting to see if it would be taken back. But I wasn't going to take anything back, because I hadn't said anything to begin with. And that was what made it all so much better. They weren't shaken because I gloated or screamed or demanded their respect. They were shaken because I never needed it in the first place. And that realization, I think, was the part they couldn't stand. The kitchen window was cracked open a sliver, and through it I could hear a dog barking in the distance and the low hum of a neighbor's TV bleeding out into the night air. The normalcy of it all hit me hard. How outside nothing had changed, while inside everything had. For years I'd imagined a moment like this, though I'd never expected it to come wrapped in apple crumble and strained politeness. I'd pictured gallery lights and opening night champagne, or maybe a magazine feature that one of them stumbled across by accident, forcing them to confront what they never saw in me. But this quiet undoing of everything they thought they knew, was better than anything I had rehearsed in the privacy of my mind. And the best part was, it hadn't been orchestrated. I hadn't come into that dinner looking for revenge. I hadn't planned the timing. I hadn't baited anyone or waited for a moment to pounce. All I had done was sit there, eat my food, and let the truth do its own damn work. Behind me, I could hear Greg speaking again, but his voice had lost all of its usual edges. It came out uncertain, as if he wasn't sure who he was talking to anymore, or what response he could expect. He said my name first, just my name, like maybe that would be enough to pull me back into whatever script he was trying to repair. When I didn't respond, he cleared his throat and tried again, telling me that it was really impressive that I'd made it into the governor's office. And then something about how art's gotten a lot more attention in politics lately. He sounded like a man trying to reframe the conversation, to put me back into some narrative where he could still have a place of authority. But it was too late for that. He'd spent years turning every conversation into a performance, always the star, always the expert, and now he didn't know what to do when no one applauded. Mom, for once, said nothing at all. That, more than anything, told me how deep this went for her. She wasn't angry, I knew that. She was stunned. She had built an entire world around the idea that Greg was the success, and I was the cautionary tale. She hadn't done it cruelly, not exactly, but out of fear, out of her own need for order. Greg had followed the rules. I had broken every one. And in her mind, breaking the rules was supposed to come with punishment, not reward. She couldn't process a reality where my defiance had led somewhere beautiful. She had never imagined that my silence wasn't surrender, but resistance. And now, confronted with that truth, she had nothing left to say. I finished rinsing the last plate, turned off the faucet, and dried my hands slowly. The dish towel was scratchy, and I focused on that small texture, as if it might keep me grounded in a moment that felt almost too surreal to hold. I didn't turn around until the dishes were stacked neatly in the rack, each one gleaming under the soft kitchen light. When I did finally face them, Greg was still standing by the table, holding his phone loosely like it had betrayed him. And Mom was staring at the empty chair where I had been sitting, her expression unreadable. Dad had moved to the living room, out of sight, but I could feel his presence like a quiet, steady drumbeat. I didn't raise my voice when I spoke. I didn't need to. "Some of us don't talk," I said, my voice calm, maybe even kind. "Some of us just work." Greg opened his mouth, maybe to argue or maybe to agree. I'll never know, because I didn't wait for a response. I picked up my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked past him without looking back. The hallway felt longer than it should have, like every step echoed a little too loudly, like the whole house had gone hollow. At the front door, I paused, hand on the knob, and let the silence behind me settle once more. "You know," I said without turning around, "for years I thought I was the one falling behind. I thought I was wasting time, wasting money, wasting space. But it turns out I was just building something you never bothered to see." I waited, just for a breath, to see if anyone would speak. No one did. Then I opened the door and stepped out into the night. The air was crisp, cooler than I expected, and for a moment I stood there on the porch, letting it wash over me. The stars above were faint but present, the way they always are when you're far enough from city lights to notice them. Somewhere a few houses down, a wind chime rattled gently in the breeze, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no weight on my shoulders. No need to prove, explain, defend, or apologize. I had walked into that house as the girl they remembered, quiet, struggling, forgettable. I walked out a woman they no longer knew how to categorize. And that was enough. I didn't need to tell them about the new commission from a museum in DC, or the grant I'd just received from a National Arts Foundation. I didn't need to show them the email from a gallery in Berlin asking if I'd be willing to travel for a future exhibit. Let them sit with what little they had seen. Let them fill in the blanks. Let them wonder what else they missed while they were too busy laughing. Revenge hadn't been the plan. I never needed it to be, but damn, it felt good.